Okay, so two things, oopsies, to remember. So far we've worked with solving one-step equations, so where we just did an inverse operation to isolate the variable. So if, we had addition, we would do subtraction and then get the variable by itself. Or if we had multiplication, we do division and get the variable by itself. But now this section is about when we have more than one step to isolate the variable. So we are going to use inverse operations. To isolate the variable. Okay, and remember, isolating the variable means that it is by itself. So there's just one. And it's positive. And once we have the variable by itself and positive, we are done. We've solved the equation. Okay, and of course, the second cardinal rule of equations is whatever you do on one side of the equation, you must do on the other side. So let's do a little bit of practice solving some multi-step equations. Example 1. This one says negative 3x plus 5 equals 2. So what I like to do when we do this in class, I do this with my hand up, but I'm going to do it with a color, and I always cover up the term that has the variable because that allows me to see what else I need to do in order to get that variable isolated. So first you cover up the variable term, and then you decide what do I need to do in this equation in order to start isolating the variable. So you have to cover the variable first because you can't start with the multiplication or division if there's addition or subtraction to do first. So cover the variable term. And then in this case, we have plus 5 here, and we're going to need to get rid of plus 5. And the way that we'll do that is by doing the inverse operation of addition, which is subtraction. So if I remove that, now I know that I'm subtracting. And I'm going to subtract 5. And if I subtract 5 on one side, I must subtract 5 on the other side. Okay, this gets rid of the 5. I bring down everything else, and I end up with negative 3x equals negative 3. Now I only have one term on the left, so I don't need to cover up my variable term anymore because there's just one term left. And now what I do is I look at negative 3x, and I remember that when we have a coefficient and a variable, that means multiplication. So this is negative 3 times x. So in order to get rid of that negative 3, I'm going to do the inverse operation of multiplication, and I am going to divide. And I'll divide both sides by negative 3 because that was my coefficient. And when I do that, negative 3 divided by negative 3, I end up with 1x, so it's positive and by itself. And then when I do my other division, negative 3 divided by negative 3, I just get positive 1. Example 2. This one's going to have some fractions in it. X over 8 minus 1/2 equals negative 7/2. First step, I'm going to cover up the term that contains my variable. So if I cover up that x over 8, then I'm left with minus 1/2 or negative 1/2. And in order to remove that from the left side of the equation, I need to do the inverse operation of subtraction, which is addition. So I'm going to add 1/2. And if I do it on one side, I need to do it on the other side. So then I end up with x over 8 is equal to, and then remember our signs, right? We have to make sure we keep the signs straight. Negative 7/2 plus 1/2 gives me negative 6/2. And if I simplify that, negative 6 over 2 simplifies to negative 3. So I simplify that fraction to negative 3. Now, on the left, my variable is still not isolated because it is not by itself. So when I look at this, x over 8, fraction bar means divide, so this is x divided by 8. In order to get rid of that 8, I'm going to do the inverse operation of division, which is multiplication. So I'm going to multiply by 8, or 8 over 1. And if I do it on one side, I must do it on the other side. So this gets rid of the 8. And it leaves me with just x equals negative 3 times 8 is negative 24. Okay, here are 3 examples for you to try and practice in order to work on solving multi-step equations. So if you want to pause the video, practice these on your own, and then check back to see how you did. The first one, my first step, if I cover up my variable term, oops, that kind of covered up my plus sign too. Cover up my variable term, I have plus 12. So the first thing I'm going to need to do is subtract 12, the inverse operation of addition. And if I do it on one side, I need to do it on the other side. And then I bring everything down. 2x equals negative 8. Now I am left with 2x, which means 2 times x. So I'll do the inverse of multiplication, which is division, on both sides, which gets rid of that coefficient 2. And I am left with x equals negative 4. All right. Next one, if we go over to the right, 2/5 plus 4a equals negative 6/5. I'm going to cover my variable term and work with whatever else is on that same side of the equation. So here I have 2/5, and that's a positive 2/5. So in order to get rid of positive 2/5, to get it down to 0, I would subtract 2/5. And if I do that on one side, I will do that on the other side. Subtract 2/5 from both sides. Then bring down everything that we didn't use, the 4a, the equal sign, and I'll do my math. Negative 6/5 minus 2/5 is a negative 8/5. Then my last step, 4a means 4 times a. So to get rid of the 4, I need to do the inverse operation of multiplication, which is division. And if I divide by 4 on one side, I need to divide by 4 on the other side. Now careful, because remember, dividing by 4 means copy dot flop, right? So if we divided by 4 over 1, we really need to do our copy dot flop in order to fully simplify this. So cross simplify, negative 2 and 1, we get negative 2 over 5. So a is equal to negative 2/5. All right, and finally, down on the bottom, negative z over 3 plus 5 is equal to 9. So first start off by covering our variable term and dealing with whatever else is on that same side of the equation. So plus 5, in order to move forward, we're going to need to subtract 5. Oops. Subtract 5 on both sides. And bring everything else down. Negative z over 3 is equal to 4. 9 minus 5 is 4. Now, the negative sign in front of that negative z over 3, this can go, it makes the whole fraction negative. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to multiply by a negative as well so that we get rid of that negative sign, right? Because a negative times a negative is a positive. So what I'm going to do is this is z over 3, and it's negative. I'm going to do the inverse operation of division, which is multiplication, and I'm going to multiply both sides by negative 3. Because by doing that, I get rid of the 3's and I get rid of the negative signs, because a negative times a negative will give me a positive. So then it gives me a positive z equals negative 12. All right, the second part of this multi-step equation section is that we always need to combine like terms before we solve. So if you have multiple terms that can be combined, if they're like terms, you need to combine the like terms first before you solve. So combine the like terms, get all the like terms together and simplified, and then solve your equation. Okay, for example, solve 3y minus 8y equals 25. So according to our instructions, we need to combine like terms before solving. So in this case, we have two like terms that we need to combine before we can start to solve. If we don't combine the like terms, we are going to likely make a mistake in our work, and it's going to be a lot harder. So you've got to combine the like terms before you start to solve. All right, 3y and negative 8y are like terms because they have the same variable taken to the same power. So we can just simply combine their coefficients. 3 minus 8 is negative 5, and then we tack that variable on because it stays with the coefficients, equals 25. From here, it's just going to be a one-step equation to solve. Negative 5y means negative 5 times y, so we'll do the inverse of multiplication, and we will divide both sides by 5. And we end up with y equals 25 divided by negative 5 is negative 5. One more like this, of course with fractions. Negative 6 equals 1/4 w minus 1/2 w. Okay, according to our rules, we must combine like terms before we can solve. These are like terms because they have the same variable taken to the same power. So we need to combine the coefficients. We need to do 1/4 minus 1/2. And we can't do that until we get a common denominator. So first I need to get a common denominator. 4 would be my common denominator. So 1/4 is going to stay the same, and 1/2 becomes 2/4. Then I can subtract my denominator, or my numerators. 1 minus 2 is negative 1, and our denominator stays 4. So when I combine the like terms, I get negative 1/4 w equals negative 6. And then it just becomes a one-step equation to solve. Remember to get rid of a fractional coefficient, such as this. To get rid of a fractional coefficient, we multiply by its reciprocal. So if the fraction is negative 1/4, the reciprocal is negative 4/1. And if I do it on one side, I multiply the other side also by negative 4. The reason we do this is because when I cross simplify, I can get rid of the 4's. Those become 1's, and I get rid of the negative signs so that my variable is positive. And negative 4 times negative 6 is positive 24 equals w. All right, here's a couple to try. All right, go ahead and pause the video if you want to try these on your own, and then check back to see how you did. Starting with this first one on the left, my like terms are my constants. Okay, and we only combine the like terms on one side of the equation. If we move across the equal sign, we have to do inverse operations. So we just combine on the left side here. We can combine our constants. So 4 plus 3 is 7. And negative 2y does not have any like terms, so that's just going to get brought down. Everything else gets brought down. Now we can follow our rules for two-step equations, cover up our variable term, and we just have a positive 7. So to get rid of that positive 7, we'll subtract 7 on both sides. Oops, I need to, hold on, I gotta erase that big purple spot. Okay, here we go. We'll subtract 7 on both sides. And bring everything down. Negative 2y equals negative 16. And then my last step is going to be to get y by itself by doing the inverse operation of multiplication, which would be division by negative 2. And if I do it on one side, I must do it on the other side. So we end up with y equals positive 8. Okay, looking at the other equation here. First step, combine the like terms. 7x and 10x are like terms because they have the same variable taken to the same power. So we combine the coefficients. 7 minus 10 is negative 3x equals 15. And then it just leaves us with one more step. Inverse of multiplication would be division by negative 3. Division by negative 3. And we get x then is equal to negative 5. All right, and here's our little word problem. It says you install 500 feet of invisible fence along the perimeter of a yard. The width is 100 feet. So the width of the yard is 100 feet. What is the length of the yard? So I always like to draw these. Anything that has to do with geometry or word problems, I like to draw so that we can be clear and visualize what we're looking for. So we know that the perimeter, which means the distance around the yard. So the perimeter, remember, is all of the sides added together. So this plus this plus this plus this will give us that, oops, I'm going to erase those lines, that perimeter of 500 feet. That's the distance around. The other thing that we know about the yard is that the width of the yard is, what did they say, 100 feet. So we know that it is 100 feet wide. And we know that about the top and about the bottom, right? Because if it's a rectangle, so the width is the same top and bottom. We are asked, what is the length of the yard? A lot of times they'll tell you the variable that they want you to use. So in this case, they want us to use L for length. So we need to figure out the length. So as we've been doing in this chapter, the first part they're going to make you do is write an equation. So you're going to need an equal sign, and you are going to need a variable so that you can solve for something. So what we're going to write is an equation for the perimeter of this equation, or of this yard. We know that the perimeter is 500, and then we're going to write an equation to model how we would get to 500. Well, we know to get to 500, we add up all the sides. 100 plus L plus 100 plus L. And then we can combine the like terms on the right side. We would have 2L plus 200. So this is going to be my equation. And from here, now I have something that I can solve for and get L by itself to figure out what the length is on this yard. So first, if I covered up my L, my variable term, first thing I would do is subtract 200 from each side. And then I would get 300 is equal to 2 times L. And my last step is going to be to divide both sides by 2. So I get that L, the length of one side of this yard, is 150 feet. Okay, the key here, you guys, and like we've been talking about quite a bit, the key is being able to write this equation. So yes, you can guess and check and figure out what the length is, but the key and what we're trying to learn how to do in this chapter is be able to write an equation that contains an equal sign and a variable so that we can then solve for the variable.